Spring, 1945. A cold wind moves across a stretch of muddy ground outside a hastily constructed Allied processing camp. The war is collapsing, but its weight still hangs in the air like smoke that refuses to clear. A line of German nurses stands silently in their worn field uniforms. Red Cross armbands faded, boots soaked, eyes hollow from weeks of retreat and sleepless evacuations. They clutch small canvas pouches, the last possessions not lost to the chaos. An Allied sergeant moves down the line, inspecting each item with practiced caution. Metal objects, papers, personal belongings. Most are taken away, dropped into a wooden crate already filled with confiscated items from dozens of other prisoners. But then he pauses. A young German nurse, barely in her 20s, trembling from cold and fear, opens her pouch and reveals only a single object, a creased photograph of her family. For a moment, the sergeant studies her face, then the photo, then her face again. He nods. "Keep it." She breaks, shoulders shaking, tears falling onto the mud at her feet. It is in this small, human moment that the deeper story begins, one shaped not by weapons or orders, but by what people carried into captivity. To understand why a single photograph could shatter the composure of a German military nurse in 1945, one must return to the world these women came from, a world defined by duty, scarcity, collapsing fronts, and the constant movement of wounded men. By the final year of the war, Germany's medical infrastructure had become one of the last functioning systems in the Reich, held together largely by the hands of young women trained under the Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, DRK, Wehrmacht medical branches, Luftwaffe auxiliaries, and various civilian emergency services pressed into military roles. More than 130,000 German women served as nurses or medical auxiliaries during the war. Many worked in field hospitals. Others served in reserve hospitals, hospital trains, casualty clearing stations, and air raid rescue units. Their days were ruled by the sound of ambulance engines, the shuffle of stretchers, and the clipped orders of overworked doctors struggling to manage the endless stream of wounded from the Eastern Front. Long shifts were spent cleaning infected wounds, rationing bandages, improvising splints, and searching for morphine that no longer arrived. The war consumed every corner of their lives. By 1944, many nurses had been shifted closer to the front lines as medical units retreated with the collapsing Wehrmacht. Others found themselves trapped in surrounded cities, caring for the wounded inside makeshift bunkers lit by lanterns when electricity failed. Berlin, Königsberg, Budapest, Breslau all saw young women racing between concrete stairwells and cellar wards, navigating rubble-filled streets under artillery fire. Bombing raids forced the rapid evacuation of hospitals, often with only minutes to decide which wounded men could be moved and which would be left behind. Amid this chaos, one constant remained: the small pouches of personal items nurses carried with them everywhere. Soap, a handkerchief, a folded letter, and nearly always a photograph. A mother, a fiancé, a brother on the Western Front. A family portrait taken long before the war hollowed out the nation's hope. These photos were not luxuries. They were anchors. As the Eastern Front collapsed in late 1944 and early 1945, thousands of nurses fled westward with retreating units. Hospital trains overloaded with wounded were attacked from the air. Field stations were abandoned overnight. Many women marched for days without food, guiding amputees and fever-stricken soldiers along frozen roads. Nurses who remained behind risked becoming prisoners of the Soviet army, where treatment varied wildly, depending on a unit and circumstances. Fear traveled with every rumor, and there were many. When these nurses ultimately crossed paths with British or American forces, they were exhausted beyond description. Many had lived for months inside ruins, slept beside wounded men, or treated casualties with almost no supplies. Their uniforms were patched, their hands cracked from cold and disinfectant. Their sense of identity hung by a thread. And when surrender finally came, it brought its own terror. Under Allied military regulations, all captured personnel, combatants or not, were required to undergo detailed searches. Personal items were inspected for intelligence value, military insignia, or hidden notes. Watches, knives, field gear, documents, and in some cases diaries were confiscated. For women who had carried nearly nothing across collapsing front lines, losing even the smallest keepsake felt like losing the last piece of who they had been. To the Allies, confiscation was procedure. To the nurses, it felt like erasure. Family photographs were especially delicate cases. Some contained men in uniform or showed relatives whose identities the Allied authorities wished to verify. Others were feared to contain coded messages or military affiliations. As a result, many were collected, assessed, and sometimes withheld. 4 German nurses, who had seen hospitals burn, seen the wounded abandoned, seen their own futures dissolve. These photographs represented not only memory, but survival. Keeping them meant they had something left, something that had not been destroyed. This is why, in 1945, the moment an Allied soldier stepped forward and quietly said, "You can keep it," carried a weight far larger than the words spoken. It meant her world, shattered though it was, had not been reduced entirely to ash. It meant someone recognized her humanity. And as these women stood, trembling in that fragile space between war and captivity, the meaning of that single act of mercy began to unfold. The wider story now turns to the deeper environment that shaped their experiences: the collapsing fronts, the flight westward, and the uneven treatment of medical personnel across Allied lines. By early 1945, the world these nurses moved through had become a vast, shifting landscape of collapsing armies and desperate civilians. Every front was contracting, every remaining hospital was overwhelmed, and every crossroads seemed to carry a flow of refugees, wounded soldiers, and retreating units. For nurses attached to the Wehrmacht or the Red Cross, the front was no longer a distant line. It was everywhere. The psychological state of these women was shaped by 2 forces: duty that kept them near the wounded, and fear that followed them through every retreat. Many had taken oaths that emphasized service regardless of hardship, and so they stayed long after others were evacuated. Some remained because they felt responsible for the men they treated. Others remained because they believed surrendering alone, without a military unit, was too dangerous. The chaos intensified as Germany fractured. Hospital trains, once the lifeline of the medical system, became moving targets. Allied aircraft struck them whether they carried wounded or not. Markings were not always visible, and fronts shifted faster than information could keep up. Nurses who served on these trains wrote in later memoirs of sprinting through narrow corridors as bombs fell nearby, shielding wounded men with their bodies, or desperately trying to move patients off a burning wagon. In towns like Aachen, Metz, Trier, and the many villages along the Western Front, medical stations operated until the very hour Allied troops entered. Nurses treated soldiers during artillery barges, losing windows, walls, and sometimes entire wards in minutes. When the order to withdraw finally came, they often fled with nothing but their medical satchels and whatever personal items they could hide beneath their uniforms. This is where the importance of personal belongings, especially family photos, became sharply magnified. In the absence of safety, certainty, or home, these objects became the final reminders of identity. Many nurses carried photographs, wrapped in cloth, to keep them safe from moisture during marches. Some wrote the names of relatives on the back, fearing separation or death. Others kept multiple images: a parent, siblings, a husband at the front. They were not tokens of nationalism or political ideology. They were reminders of a world untouched by ruin. Yet as the Reich fell apart, the fate of these women depended entirely on which Allied force they encountered. Differences between Western and Eastern captivity. Encounters with Soviet troops varied drastically. In some locations, medical personnel were treated with a degree of respect because their skills were needed. In others, chaos, anger, and hunger shaped behavior in destructive ways. Countless German nurses fled westward specifically to avoid Soviet capture. Rumors traveled faster than military reports. Stories of violence, disappearances, and harsh reprisals. Some rumors were exaggerated. Many were not. By contrast, German nurses who surrendered to American or British forces faced uncertainty, but generally more predictable procedures. Western Allied military police followed standardized protocols: search, identification, documentation, and separation of medical staff from combatants. Even at the end, regulations mattered. But these same regulations meant absolute scrutiny of every personal item. Photographs showing men in SS uniforms or officers could trigger additional questioning. Images of hospitals, equipment, or military installations could be treated as intelligence. Even innocent family portraits could be seized if they were glued to documents, written on the back, or clipped to letters. To the nurses, losing these photos was unbearable. To Allied officers, it was simply part of security policy. Processing camps and uncertain status. Another complication lay in how German nurses were classified. They were not ordinary civilians, nor were they frontline combatants. Many were technically non-combatant auxiliaries, but their uniforms and roles varied. DRK, Wehrmachtsfallfahrinnen, Kriegsluftschütze, Luftwaffe medical helpers, and more. Some wore military-style uniforms. Others wore Red Cross dresses or improvised garments. This ambiguity meant that, upon surrender, they could be treated as POWs, detained civilians, or temporary internees, depending on the Allied unit processing them. This variation had profound effects on whether they could keep personal items. Some Allied officers saw the women as harmless medical staff. Others, especially those still raw from the brutal final months of fighting, regarded anyone in uniform with suspicion. The nurses could not predict which reaction they would face. What they did know was that everything about their lives, identity papers, bags, letters, and photographs, now depended on the mercy, suspicion, or mood of the soldiers before them. And so, at the moment of surrender, when they were lined up under watchful guards, exhausted and holding the last remnants of their lives in small bundles, the possibility of losing even a single photograph felt like losing the final proof that they had once belonged somewhere. This emotional tension leads directly into the next dimension of the story, the angles that reveal why such a seemingly simple act held overwhelming psychological weight. Understanding why German nurses cried when allowed to keep family photographs requires moving beyond the moment itself and examining the many layers shaping that reaction. These angles reveal the emotional, tactical, procedural, and psychological forces converging in 1945, forces that turned a small photograph into something far greater. For German nurses, photographs were not simple keepsakes. They were emotional anchors in a world that no longer resembled the one they had known. Many nurses had not seen their families for years. Others had received only scattered letters, often censored or delayed, their contents little more than fragments of home. As the Reich's infrastructure collapsed, mail delivery became unreliable. Women stationed in forward medical posts often went months without word from parents, husbands, or children. In these circumstances, a family photograph became more than an image. It became a lifeline. Nurses kept them inside breast pockets, in small leather wallets, or wrapped in handkerchiefs inside medical satchels. During night shifts in underground wards, amid the groans of wounded soldiers and the echo of distant shelling, many nurses glanced at these photos for reassurance. In hospital trains, shaking from motion and fear, some held the images tightly during air raids. Every retreat, every burned hospital, Every bombardment dissolved more of their old lives. Homes had been destroyed, families displaced or killed, entire cities wiped out. In some cases, the photograph they carried was the only surviving image of a parent or sibling. So when Allied Guard confiscated other items, knives, watches, insignia, letters, they could bear it. But when a hand reached for the photograph, it felt as though their final connection to the world before the war was being taken. When a guard finally said, "You may keep it," the emotional dam often broke. It wasn't the permission alone that caused tears. It was the confirmation that something deeply personal, something that had survived the collapse of their nation and the terror of retreat, would not be taken from them. From the Allied perspective, the search procedures were not emotional, they were necessary. All captured personnel, regardless of gender or role, underwent detailed inspections. German nurses, despite being non-combatants, were still part of the military system, and the Allies could not ignore the possibility that uniforms or Red Cross markings might conceal intelligence materials. Documents were scrutinized first. Identification papers, medical assignment slips, hospital transfer orders, all were examined, especially if they listed military unit numbers. Any photograph attached to a document became part of that document and could be confiscated until cleared by intelligence officers. Nurses rarely understood this distinction. To them, a photo glued to a certificate was still a photo of their mother or sister, not a military item. Search teams were often overworked, surrounded by hundreds of prisoners needing to be processed quickly. It was not uncommon for soldiers to collect whole bundles of personal materials simply to keep lines moving. Only after initial processing were items sorted and sometimes returned. This led to emotional eruptions when an Allied guard, aware of the growing tension and recognizing the innocence of a simple family picture, chose to return it immediately. For the nurse who had spent days believing she would lose everything, that moment felt like a reprieve from a relentless system. It was not sentimental policy. It was a practical decision layered with human mercy. The power dynamic of surrender made the moment even heavier. The nurses were exhausted, confused, and utterly dependent on the decisions of strangers. A single act of permission carried the weight of freedom, fear, and desperately needed dignity. Another layer to the story lies in how German nurses viewed themselves at the moment of surrender. They were not civilians, yet they were not soldiers. Their uniforms marked them as part of a defeated military machine, even though most had never fired a weapon. Many had joined the Red Cross or Wehrmacht medical services to help, not to fight. But as the Reich fell, uniforms, even nursing ones, became symbols of suspicion. This created an intense identity crisis. When Allied forces disarmed and processed German medical staff, the women often felt stripped of the one role that gave them purpose: caregivers. They had spent years holding the hands of dying soldiers, stitching wounds, and keeping men alive under impossible conditions. Now, with the war ending, their uniforms no longer represented service. They represented defeat. The personal items they carried became the only visible reminder that they were still individuals. A family photograph was proof of a life beyond the uniform. It was a reminder that they had been daughters, wives, mothers, not merely extensions of the military system collapsing around them. So when an Allied officer returned a family photo instead of discarding it with military paperwork, it felt like the first acknowledgement of personal identity they had received since surrender. For women who had lost autonomy, lost control, and lost their place in the world, this acknowledgement was overwhelming. These angles form the psychological and procedural core of the story. But there are still deeper dimensions: moral, cultural, and operational factors that further shape the emotional weight of these moments. The emotional depth behind these moments becomes clearer when viewed through broader historical and cultural lenses. Beyond the human and procedural realities, additional angles reveal how guilt, survival, cultural values, and the symbolism of personal belongings converged in the final days of the war. For many German nurses, 1945 was not merely a moment of military defeat. It was a moment filled with moral uncertainty. While the majority of nurses were not political actors, they were still part of a system that had inflicted immense suffering across Europe. As the Third Reich collapsed, many were confronted, sometimes for the first time, with the scale of devastation their nation had brought upon others. Some had treated wounded soldiers who admitted to atrocities. Others had been stationed near concentration camps or witnessed the arrival of emaciated prisoners in medical facilities. A few had been compelled by superiors to follow protocols they privately disagreed with. Most had been shielded from political knowledge by distance and military compartmentalization. But by 1945, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. This created an emotional burden that manifested sharply at surrender. Nurses feared punishment, ostracism, or being blamed for crimes they had not committed. They feared that being in uniform, even a nursing one, made them complicit in the eyes of the victors. In this state of internal turmoil, a family photograph represented innocence. It symbolized a time before moral confusion and military collapse. When an Allied guard returned a nurse's photo, it felt like a brief absolution, a reassurance that they were being seen not as symbols of the Reich, but as human beings caught in its machinery. It was not forgiveness in a formal sense, but it was a moment in which humanity was recognized despite the shadows of the war. For individuals already carrying the weight of guilt, fear, and moral conflict, this emotional release could be overwhelming. To understand the intensity of these reactions, it is crucial to recognize the cultural value of family in German civilian life, both before and during the war. Pre-war German households, especially in rural or conservative regions, emphasized tight-knit family bonds, generational duty, and a strong sense of connection to home. Nurses drawn from these environments often kept detailed family albums, postcards, and formal portraits. Photography had become widely accessible by the 1930s, making family pictures treasured items in nearly every home. When men were drafted, wives and daughters frequently exchanged photos as symbolic anchors of loyalty and endurance. By 1945, with homes destroyed and families scattered across collapsing borders, a single photo could represent everything a woman feared she might never see again. It might be the last surviving image of a father killed in air raids, a brother on the Eastern Front, or a home that no longer existed. Allied soldiers came from cultures where similar values existed, but the circumstances of German collapse magnified the emotional charge. Surrender meant uncertainty about the future of Germany itself. Would families be reunited? Would borders shift? Would loved ones survive the refugee trails? Would there even be a home to return to? Thus, keeping a photograph wasn't merely about memory. It was about holding on to a future that felt increasingly fragile. When an Allied guard acknowledged that fragility by allowing the nurse to keep the picture, the relief felt like a small restoration of the world she feared had been lost forever. In every army and every war, possessions take on greater symbolic meaning when soldiers or medical personnel face captivity. It is a universal truth. Those who lose control over their environment cling fiercely to whatever objects remain within their power. For German nurses, the transition from authority, even limited medical authority, to complete powerlessness happened in an instant. Only hours earlier, they might have been administering morphine, organizing triage, or comforting the wounded. Now they stood in line under guard, unable to influence anything around them. In such moments, possessions become extensions of identity. A watch might symbolize time and order. A Bible or prayer book might symbolize faith. A piece of jewelry might symbolize family heritage or a bond with someone waiting at home. But photographs were the most cherished of all. Unlike documents or medals, they carried no political meaning. Unlike jewelry or money, They had no practical value to guards. Their worth lay entirely in emotion, and therefore could not be replaced. Other prisoners of war experienced similar reactions, but for nurses, overwhelmingly young, vulnerable, and suddenly stripped of purpose, the loss of a photograph felt deeply personal. This is why Allied guards, trained to confiscate but also trained to recognize non-threatening items, sometimes softened when they reached a nurse holding a small folded portrait with trembling hands. When permission was granted, it did more than preserve a possession. It preserved identity. It preserved memory. It preserved the one point of stability in a disintegrating reality. These angles complete the full psychological, moral, cultural, and symbolic dimension of the moment. Together, they lead us toward the decisive turning point, when procedures, emotions, and the final collapse of Germany converged in a single climactic moment. Night settles over the front like a heavy curtain, but nothing is quiet. The sky flashes in violent bursts of white, each artillery strike momentarily freezing the world in stark silhouettes. Helmets lowered, bodies pressed into mud, hands trembling as they reload in darkness. By early 1945, the war has reached a point where every side feels cornered. Supplies are thin, tempers are thinner, and the military hospitals, once stable pillars behind the lines, become chaotic crossroads of retreat, collapse, and desperate survival. Amid this chaos, the story of the women involved takes a decisive turn. What had begun months earlier as routine duty has now become a test of endurance under fire. Casualty convoys arrive without warning. Medical tents overflow with wounded men, some carried in by stretcher teams barely able to stand themselves. Nurses, orderlies, and auxiliaries who once worked in predictable rhythms are now forced into triage so severe that decisions must be made in seconds. For many of the female personnel, the front has moved so close that the notion of rear area safety dissolves entirely. Some are trapped as encirclement lines tighten. Others are ordered to evacuate, but find the roads choked with refugees, broken vehicles, and scattered units retreating under pressure. A few, stationed at forward aid posts, are forced into roles no training had prepared them for, assisting surgeons during bombardments, pulling wounded soldiers out of burning trucks, or keeping operating lamps steady when generators fail and the only light is the flicker of a kerosene lantern. The climax begins in this atmosphere of collapse. It is here, in one makeshift hospital established inside a half-destroyed schoolhouse, that the turning point arrives. The walls shake with every near hit. Dust rains from the ceiling in fine white clouds that settle on instruments, on blankets, on open wounds that must be cleaned again and again. The cold is so intense that surgeons operate wearing wool gloves with the fingertips cut away. Breath fogs the air. The smell of antiseptic mixes with smoke from a nearby fire that no one has been able to extinguish for hours. The women working inside know the line cannot hold much longer. Reports filter in, scattered, contradictory, frightening. Enemy forces are advancing faster than expected. A breakthrough several kilometers away has exposed the flank. Communication wires are down. Radio signals are jammed with panicked voices. And then comes the order that changes everything. Prepare for immediate evacuation. Enemy units sighted approaching the outskirts. For the medical staff, there is no choice to make. They must move, and they must take the wounded with them. Stretchers are lifted. Medical kits strapped across backs. The dim school corridors echo with hurried footsteps as women guide the wounded toward the courtyard. Snow blows in through shattered windows. A burning vehicle outside casts a pulsing glow that turns every movement into stark black and white shadows. But outside, the scene is even worse. A column of trucks meant for evacuation has already been hit. Two vehicles lie on their sides, wheels still spinning uselessly. Another burns with a deep, roaring flame that forces everyone to shield their faces from the heat. Drivers shout for directions. Officers shout for order. Wounded men groan, some pleading to be left where they lie. The entire withdrawal is seconds away from falling apart. And then, over the distant ridge, the unmistakable crack of incoming fire. Whistles, explosions, shrapnel slicing through the cold wind. The medical teams hit the ground instinctively. The wounded cannot. Women pull stretchers behind fragments of walls or overturned carts, forming makeshift shields with their own bodies. Snow erupts in dark plumes as mortars land closer and closer. Those who can still move look toward the tree line beyond the courtyard. That path, unguarded, narrow, nearly invisible, may be the only route left. But time is running out. Officers debate whether they can risk a retreat through the woods. Drivers insist that the trucks can still move if they clear the debris. Nurses argue that the gravely wounded will not survive being carried through snow on foot. The ground shakes again. Another shell, another scream, and it becomes clear that a decision must be made, not in minutes, but in seconds. Lives depend on it, their own lives included. In the flashing light of distant fires, with the roar of collapsing front lines behind them, the women look toward the path disappearing into the forest. Because whichever direction a retreat goes next will determine who escapes, who is captured, and who never leaves this place at all. And this is where the second half of the climax begins. The moment the retreat fractures into a desperate race for survival. The retreat begins badly. The moment the first stretcher team tries to move toward the forest path, another barrage erupts, closer, sharper, the kind of fire that announces the enemy is no longer distant but already pressing in. The courtyard fills with splintering stone and shredded snow. Someone shouts for everyone to scatter. Someone else yells to hold position. Orders dissolve into instinct. The trucks finally lurch forward, engines coughing, metal groaning as they push past broken masonry. But there are too many wounded to fit. Dozens must be carried by hand. Nurses, auxiliaries, clerks, and medical orderlies shoulder the weight with numb fingers and raw determination, trudging step by step through the frozen slush. The line becomes a long, jagged trail of silhouettes moving toward the trees, stumbling, slipping, regrouping. A lantern swings wildly in someone's grip, throwing shaky arcs of light that carve the scene into fragments. Boots sinking into mud, bandaged arms hanging limp. A nurse gripping a stretcher pole so hard her knuckles go white. Behind them, the last standing wall of the schoolhouse collapses in a billow of smoke. And then a new sound cuts through everything. Not artillery, not mortar fire, but voices. Foreign, sharp, commanding. The enemy is closer than anyone believed. A burst of automatic fire rakes the snow ahead, deliberately meant to stop the retreat rather than kill. Panic sweeps the column. Some try to run. Others freeze. A few attempt to hide stretchers behind fallen logs, refusing to abandon the wounded even when it means exposing themselves. Within minutes, the entire medical group is surrounded. Flashlights beam through the trees. Boots crunch across the snow. Shouts echo in clipped, authoritative commands. Hands go up slowly. Medical satchels fall to the ground. The wounded are laid gently into the snow as the women step forward, exhausted, shivering, but refusing to show fear. The capture is methodical. Weapons are kicked aside, pockets searched, identification taken. A guard orders the women to stand together. Another photographs each stretcher, documenting the wounded for later transfer. The cold bites through their uniforms, but no one moves. For the women of the unit, this moment is a collision of exhaustion and disbelief. Many had feared this outcome for months. Others never imagined they would be taken alive. Some fight back tears. Some stare at the ground. A few stand straight, refusing to let fear define their posture. And then comes the hardest part. The group is separated. The wounded are loaded first, carried onto improvised sleds, dragged toward enemy field stations. The medical staff tries to follow, insisting they must care for their patients, but rifles block their path. They are told firmly, repeatedly, "You will be processed separately." A young nurse protests, tears freezing on her cheeks. Another tries to hand over a medical chart she has kept tucked against her chest. An officer waves it away. The women are marched toward a nearby barn, its roof half gone, its doorway hanging open. Inside, straw covers the floor. The air smells of smoke and old wood. Guards station themselves at the entrance. No one speaks for several minutes. They listen instead. The distant engines, the shouted orders, the muffled cries of wounded being moved without proper transport. Every sound twists deeper than any fear they had felt before, because now they know the war has closed around them completely. Some sit in the straw, shaking uncontrollably. Some remove their scarves and place them over the youngest, trying to shield them from the cold. One woman stares at her empty hands, still shaped as if gripping a stretcher that is no longer there. And as the barn door slams shut, the realization settles over them with crushing weight. They're prisoners now. The front line has passed them. The unit they served with is gone. And whatever comes next will be dictated entirely by forces they can no longer influence. But this moment of silence, fear, and raw uncertainty is only the beginning of the final chapter. Because in the aftermath of capture, the true test begins. How these women endure the long hours, the interrogations, the transfers, the cold, the hunger, and the uncertainty of their fate. The night after their capture feels longer than any the nurses had endured at the front. Cold air seeps through the gaps in the barn walls, turning every breath into a thin cloud. Some women attempt to rest, leaning against hay bales or huddling together for warmth, but sleep refuses to come. The adrenaline that carried them through the retreat has faded, replaced by a hollow, gnawing uncertainty. Before dawn, the guards return. Flashlights slice through the barn, followed by the bark of orders. The women stand, stiff and shivering, and form a line outside. Snow crunches under their boots as they are marched toward a makeshift processing station. A commandeered farmhouse with tables pushed together and lanterns hung from ceiling beams. Inside, the procedure begins. One table is for identification, another for inspecting personal belongings, a third for medical questioning. It is systematic, cold, efficient. A captured medical corps sergeant tries to answer questions for the group, but the guards insist each woman be processed individually. The nurses stand silently in line, watching as every strip of their previous identity is documented, classified, and taken. Some try to keep their composure. Others swallow back tears. Most simply stare ahead, exhausted. When their turn comes, each woman is asked the same set of questions: name, rank, unit, duties, date of assignment, last location of command. The interrogators record every answer mechanically. They rarely look up. Then comes the search. Pockets emptied, satchels opened, scarves removed, canteens, keys, small notebooks, pocket watches, all placed into wooden crates. But it is when they reach into their coat linings, apron folds, and field blouse pockets that something changes. Because almost every nurse carried something small, something private, something that made the war feel less suffocating. A letter, a ribbon, a pressed flower, a child's drawing sent from home, a photo tucked behind a uniform button. And for many, the photograph was the last piece of home they had left. Captured officers noticed the emotional shift immediately. One guard pauses when a nurse hesitates to relinquish a small wallet-sized portrait of her parents. She clutches it in both hands, shaking her head, whispering that it is all she has. Another woman tries to explain that her photo is not political, not military, just family. For a moment, the tension tightens. Guards exchange glances. The interrogator drums his fingers on the table. Photos were often confiscated. Personal items were seldom returned. Keeping them was never guaranteed. The women know this. They have seen others lose everything in the machinery of capture. When the order finally comes, it lands with the weight of a verdict. Personal photographs may remain. For a few seconds, no one moves. No one speaks. Then the reaction spreads in quiet ripples. A nurse exhales sharply, covering her face. Another presses her photo against her chest, eyes watering. One simply breaks down, sobbing silently, overwhelmed by the relief. The guards, unsure how to handle the sudden flood of emotion, continue processing the next woman in line. But the atmosphere has shifted. Losing their medical kits, their insignia, and their tools was expected. Losing their photos, their last connection to the world beyond captivity, had been the deepest fear. Being allowed to keep them is not a kindness in the grand scheme of war. It has not changed their status, their uncertainty, their hunger, or their exhaustion. But in this moment, it feels monumental, because in captivity, small mercies strike harder than cruelty. By midday, the women are marched again, this time toward a transport convoy waiting along a frozen road. Trucks, wagons, and repurposed farm vehicles form a long chain disappearing into the tree line. The wounded capture the night before have already been moved. The nurses are ordered to board in groups of 6. The metal truck beds are cold enough that fingers stick briefly to the rails. Straw has been thrown across the floor, but it does little to soften the ride. As the engines start, a few nurses clutch their photos tightly, hiding them inside sleeves or against their skin, as though still afraid the permission might be revoked. The convoy begins to move, not fast, not slow, but steady. Snow drifts across the road. Smoke rises from distant fields. The winter sky hangs low and gray. No one knows where they are going. No one dares to ask. But the road ahead promises days of transport, new interrogations, and a long descent into the routines of captivity. A world where survival relies on endurance, cooperation, and holding on to the last pieces of humanity that war tried so hard to erase. And that road leads directly into the second part of the aftermath, where the true conditions of their imprisonment take shape. The convoy traveled for hours before the landscape finally changed. Fields gave way to dense forest. Forest opened into rolling hills. Smoke from scattered chimneys marked villages the women did not recognize, places whose names they would later record in notebooks, trying to reconstruct the route of their captivity long after the war ended. By late afternoon, the convoy halted near a rail junction. The nurses were ordered out. Breathless, stiff, and unsteady from the cold, they waited as guards checked manifests and exchanged clipped instructions. A long line of boxcars stood on a side track, some with sliding doors open, straw on the floor, and lanterns hung at the entrances. These were not built for passengers. They were built for cargo. But in winter 1944, there was no distinction left. Troops, prisoners, supplies, wounded, all traveled in whatever transport could be found. The women were grouped into a single car. Inside, the air was stale and metallic, the walls coated with old frost. Straw scattered across the floor offered minimal insulation. A small barrel stove sat in one corner, unlit. There were no windows, only 2 narrow vents cut near the roofline. When the heavy sliding door closed, the darkness settled like a weight. For a moment, the nurses stood silently, adjusting to the cramped space, shivering as the cold closed in around them. Some sat immediately, pulling blankets tighter around shoulders. Others leaned against the walls, trying to brace themselves for the unknown stretch ahead. The train jerked once, twice, and then began to move. Hours blurred together. The wheels clattered over frozen track. The car swayed with every turn. A few women tried to sleep, but most remained awake, listening to the rhythm of the train, wondering how far they were being taken and how long they'd be kept. Some whispered quietly to one another, exchanging small details of home or their units, each story a thread of connection in the dark. Others clutched their allowed belongings, the precious photographs held like fragile anchors to the world beyond war. One nurse, wrapped in a torn wool blanket, ran her fingers repeatedly along the edge of her photo, tracing the faces of her family. She did not speak for hours, but anyone watching her understood the meaning. In captivity, memory becomes a kind of shelter. By dawn, the train slowed. Guards shouted outside. Boots thudded along the length of the car. Then the door slid open, flooding the interior with pale winter light. The women squinted, raising hands to shield their eyes. Outside stood the perimeter of a transit camp. Rows of wooden huts, watchtowers, barbed wire, and thin lines of smoke rising from chimneys. It was not a permanent detention center. It was a holding point, a place where prisoners were sorted, questioned, reassigned, and moved again depending on the needs of the front. The march to the registration hut was short but difficult. Many could barely feel their feet. Frost clung to the edges of their uniforms. Inside, the building was warmer but not welcoming. Tables were arranged in a line, each staffed by clerks and officers reviewing stacks of forms. The nurses were processed again, names recorded, units verified, belongings rechecked, medical skills noted with clinical detachment. Some were assigned to labor details, others for further interrogation. A few were tasked with assisting in the camp infirmary under supervision, a reminder that even as prisoners, their medical expertise had value. The camp's conditions were harsh, but not uniformly cruel. Captivity depended heavily on location, available resources, and the temperament of commanding officers. Food was scarce, but distributed regularly. Barracks were unheated, yet straw and blankets were issued. The women slept shoulder to shoulder, rationing warmth, sharing what little comfort they could. The psychological strain, however, weighed heavier than cold or hunger. Isolation, uncertainty, the erosion of identity. Days filled with waiting, for news, for movement, for anything that broke the monotony. Interrogations came sporadically, often repeated. The questions rarely changed. Details of troop movements, supply lines, medical infrastructure. Many nurses genuinely had little to offer. Others protected what they knew, speaking only in generalities. And through it all, the smallest human moments shaped survival. A shared crust of bread, a whispered joke in a quiet moment, a nurse helping another mend a torn sleeve with a single needle secretly kept in her boot, a fading photograph passed carefully from hand to hand in the dim barracks light, each woman looking at it, recognizing the universal ache of family far away. These small acts were their defense against despair. Weeks turned into months. Transfers continued. Some women were moved to larger camps deeper inland. Others remained for extended periods, assisting with injured prisoners or working in labor detachments under supervision. But no matter where they were sent, the pattern repeated. Processing, waiting, interrogation, labor, cold, hunger, and the slow work of holding on to humanity one day at a time. And yet, through all the hardship, one detail remained constant: the photos. They survived every search, every transfer, every inspection, folded into sleeves, hidden in boots, tucked into makeshift pouches sewn from scraps of cloth. The women guarded them as fiercely as soldiers guarded rifles. Because in the bleak routine of captivity, those images were more than memories. They were proof of another life waiting somewhere beyond the wire, a life they were determined to return to. And as the war dragged toward its closing months, the forces that would eventually decide their fate were already moving, reshaping front lines, collapsing old commands and drawing the conflict toward its inevitable end. Which leads directly into the final reflection: the meaning, the endurance, and the quiet legacy these women carried long after liberation. When liberation finally came, it arrived not with grand speeches or triumphant bands, but with the quiet collapse of a system that had held millions in uncertainty. Camps emptied, guards disappeared, gates swung open with an almost surreal stillness. For many of the captured German nurses, freedom felt less like a sudden event and more like waking slowly from a long, cold dream. Some were taken in by Allied medical units for temporary care. Others walked for days to reach the nearest town. A few returned to homes that no longer existed, finding instead ruins where families had once stood on doorsteps for photographs, now worn from months of handling. But one truth remained consistent across their testimonies, memoirs, and post-war interviews. It was not the harshness of captivity they remembered most sharply. It was the small acts that preserved their sense of self. A piece of bread shared, a corner of a blanket offered, a guard who spoke softly rather than shouting, a stranger who helped carry someone too weak to continue. And above all, the photographs. Creased edges, faded ink, faces worn smooth by cold fingers tracing the same lines day after day. To historians, these photos are artifacts, evidence of the way personal identity survived within the machinery of total war. But to the women who carried them, they were lifelines. Proof that before the uniforms, before the orders, before the collapse of nations, they had belonged to families who loved them and hoped for their return. In a conflict defined by destruction on a scale the world had never seen, the survival of something as fragile as a paper photograph feels almost improbable. But that improbability is exactly what gives the story its weight. Because in war, preservation is an act of defiance, and holding on to memory is a form of endurance. The nurses who cried when they were allowed to keep those small, creased images were not expressing weakness. They were expressing humanity. A humanity that survived the front lines, the collapse, the interrogations, the transports, and the long months behind wire. A humanity that outlasted the war itself. And in the end, long after uniforms were packed away and borders redrawn, those photographs remained, silent witnesses to a truth no conflict could erase. Even in war, people fight hardest for the things that remind them they're still human.